All right, everybody, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and welcome into the SECU Daily Planet Theater. My name is Chris Smith. I work in education here at the museum, and I am your host for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. This is a weekly lecture series that's hosted by us here at the Museum of Natural Sciences, but is coordinated and organized. The people who invite the fantastic guest speakers is the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality. They do fantastic work finding really every week just the best people to come into the museum or to join us on Zoom, share with us their knowledge and insights about what's going on in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, art, nature, education, and beyond. We have great conversations, we learn new, interesting things, and we get to see the world in just a little bit of a different way every single week. We've been doing this program here at the museum now for several years, so there's an incredible archive of these programs that's on the museum's YouTube channel. Just look for Lunchtime Discovery. If you like this, you'll probably love all of the others that we've done. So take the opportunity to learn something new and go check that out. But while you're looking around on the internet, make sure you also go to the website for the Office of Environmental Education. They have incredible resources and lots more programs and events that they make available, especially if you're watching this and you're somebody who's interested in science and nature, especially a professional interested in science and nature types of things, or if you're somebody who thinks, I would like to talk to other people about science and nature, they've got resources that are out there and available for you. Today on the program, we've got one of those people who really likes to talk about science and nature to just about anybody that will listen. Chris Goforth is the head of collaborative science here at the Museum of Natural Sciences and has what might be just one of the best jobs in the museum because Chris works within research and collections here at the museum, but her office is out at Prairie Ridge Eco Station, which I think we'll hear a little bit about in the presentation, which means that Chris gets to do scientific research, be outside, and also communicate the science that she's doing with the public in lots of great and interesting ways, which just sounds like an amazing job, and it's so special that we have that opportunity for our audiences and for people here at the Museum of Natural Sciences. So, I'm excited to hear what Chris has in store for us today. Everybody put your hands together and welcome to the stage, Chris Goforth.
All right, thank you, everyone. So, I'm really excited to have you all here today. This is the most people I've seen in this room for a while, so this is exciting. So I'm going to be talking today about two of my Dragonfly-themed citizen science projects. And so citizen science is a way for people who are non-experts to participate in scientific research. So these projects are open to everyone's participation. And these two projects that I'm going to talk about today invite a lot of people to take part in them. And we've learned some really great things through these collaborations that we have with the public. And so let's dive into some information about dragonflies that I've gathered with 10,000 or more of my closest friends. So I'm going to talk about two different projects today. The first one is the Dragonfly Swarm Project. This is the one that sent me off into the world of citizen science in the first place, and why I'm here at the museum. I kind of accidentally created a citizen science project when I was in grad school. I saw this really cool dragonfly behavior when I was at a lake that I did water quality work at as a second job when I was working on my my advanced degree, and I was really, really excited about it. I hadn't ever seen this behavior before. I've been watching dragonflies since I was about 12 years old and hadn't ever seen them do this big swarm behavior that I saw, and I got really excited about it. And so I wrote about it on my blog that I had at the time. People started sending me stories about these other swarms that they'd seen, and I realized that that was a way that I could gather information about it. If I asked people to share stories that they had about these swarms, I could gather a lot of really great information about this behavior that I had seen one time, and there was basically no information about in the scientific literature. So I created the Dragonfly Swarm Project to help me satisfy my own curiosity, but I think this is actually a really important behavior. So let me tell you a little bit about this project. First thing I want to share is what a dragonfly swarm is. And basically it's just a big group of dragonflies that are flying around kind of in a group somewhere away from water. So dragonflies spend a lot of time by water because they need water to reproduce. They lay their eggs in water or near water, and then their immatures, their nymphs, either fall into the water if they're above the water line, or if they're in the water, they just hatch into the water. And those nymphs need to be underwater pretty much all the time to be able to survive. So you see dragonflies around water all the time. But if you see a big group of them kind of somewhere else, that's a swarm. So I'm going to show you two examples here. So the first type of swarm that I think of is a feeding swarm. I call these static feeding swarms because the dragonflies are taking advantage of localized abundant prey. So dragonflies eat little insects. They'll eat each other. They'll eat whatever they can get a hold of, but they eat a whole lot of little insects. So they'll eat things like gnats and mosquitoes, other small insects as prey animals. And they will form these feeding swarms to take advantage of large numbers of little prey insects that appear in the environment. And so what you can see here, this is actually at Prairie Ridge on the west side of Raleigh. You can see all these dragonflies kind of swarming around our garden roof. So there was a little swarm. This is a pretty small swarm. This was maybe 30 individuals. But they're kind of just swirling around the roof there, and you can see them kind of going in circles or kind of figure 8 patterns. They're kind of staying in one spot and just picking off little insects as they go. The second type of swarm, though, is a really cool one. It's a migratory swarm. This is when the habitat where these dragonflies are hanging out is no longer able to support the dragonflies, and so they get up and move en masse to some other spot. And they tend to fly in big groups. Like these migratory swarms can be millions of dragonflies. And this one happened about a year ago in Rhode Island. A huge number of dragonflies flew onto this beach where there are a lot of beachgoers. And as you can see, different people responded differently to these dragonflies coming in very large numbers off the ocean onto the beach. I would have been so thrilled to be here to see this, but some of these people were not so excited about it. This popped up on Instagram and YouTube and TikTok like thousands of times. It made national news because there were so many dragonflies and so many people were so disturbed by this that they posted this just thousands of times online. But you can see all of these dragonflies are kind of flying one direction. They're flying off the water onto land, and what I understand from people in the area, they had had some sort of kind of drought conditions that year, and so the ponds that they were normally active at were kind of drying up, and they were probably moving to go find another spot that had water where they could reproduce. So all these dragonflies just got up and moved and went to some other spot. So what... No, it's the coast, the ocean. So they've crossed some little chunk of the ocean. Okay, so the project itself. I have some scientific research questions like all scientists do with their projects. So one is I want to know how this behavior works. So I'm really curious about like just what these things are doing. I love insect behavior. Everything that I've ever done research-wise has been insect behavior. I just love sitting there and watching dragonflies do what they do. It's really exciting to me. I also did a study as a grad student where I just watched giant water bugs breathe for hours and hours and hours. So I'm kind of weird. I like things that just make me sit there and watch things. But figuring out kind of how this behavior works is really exciting to me. I also want to know what conditions lead to these swarms in the first place, because ultimately I'd really love to be able to predict when and where we can see these things. I'm not sure that's ever going to happen, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. But that's a goal of mine. And I also want to understand like why this behavior matters. Clearly, these dragonflies are doing this thing a fair bit, as you'll see. And so I want to know kind of why it exists. Like why are they doing this in the first place, and why does it matter? So I collect data in this kind of very different way than most citizen science projects. Most citizen science projects, you tell people that you have the project and then they can participate in it immediately. For me, most people see a swarm first. And so they'll see this big group of dragonflies, and then they'll look it up online because they have no idea what they're looking at. And so they'll type in something like big group of dragonflies in my yard, or dragonfly swarm, or swarm of dragonflies, or whatever. And then they end up at my project page because I have more information about dragonfly swarms than anyone in the world. And so I'm the top result in the search engines. And they end up at my project where they can read about kind of what this behavior is, what it looks like. I've got pictures and videos that people have sent me of these things. I talk about what kinds of species do this behavior. And so people can just generally kind of learn about the behavior that they saw. But then I also invite them to submit their story. And so I have a really, really fancy Google form that I have them fill out. And so this is just embedded in my old blog website. I haven't even moved it yet. But I just ask people, the only required things are their contact information, the date, time, and location of the swarm, and whether they saw a migratory swarm or a feeding swarm. But then there's also other information that's optional. They can tell me approximately how many individuals they saw. They can tell me what the weather conditions were. They can tell me what colors they saw. They can describe what the flight actually looked like. And at the very end, there's a question that allows them to kind of share whatever they want to share about their experience. And so people send me some really weird things in that question. Almost everyone actually fills it out. I thought no one would fill it out, but everyone does. And some people are absolutely thrilled and delighted by these dragonfly swarms. Other people are horrified and don't want to leave their houses because there's these giant insects outside their door and it's terrifying to them. People have asked me how to exterminate dragonflies. I've had lots of people tell me really sad stories about deaths in their family, and dragonflies have appeared in graveyards where they've been at funerals. All kinds of weird things come out of that question, but I love it. It's my favorite question, actually, in my project, because it tells me how people are responding to this behavior in a really interesting way. But one of the really great things about this particular project or this particular approach to studying this behavior is that it's not a rare behavior, but it's rarely observed. And so people have to be at the right place at the right time to actually see this behavior. This is why it makes it really impossible for me to tell people about my project and then have them go out and look for it, because they might never actually see a swarm after they learn about my project. But they're out there in pretty large numbers. And because you have to be in the right place at the right time to actually see this behavior, that makes it a really ideal type of project to use a citizen science approach. So I'm inviting people to share their information with me. I try to share as much of the results that we've gotten together back to people so that they can understand kind of what their swarm means and why it was there. But it's a really, really great opportunity to invite a lot of people to participate. We all learn together, and it's a really great approach. Okay, so what I've learned with this project. Swarms are really largely unpredictable. It is really, really, really hard to tell where one of these things is going to be. Even when conditions are exactly perfect at Prairie Ridge, I can't guarantee that there's going to be a swarm there that day. You need to have, a lot of little insects. The weather needs to be just right. It needs to be the right kind of habitat. It needs to be the right time of year. And even when all of that's perfect, you still can't predict exactly where these are going to happen. So the flight follows certain patterns. Feeding swarms typically have this kind of rectangular pattern or kind of a figure 8 pattern. And so they're kind of staying within the boundaries of that space where those little prey insects are. And so they'll kind of fly to the edge of the boundary, and then they'll come back through, and then they'll go back. So they'll either do little figure 8s or little rectangles. Migratory swarms, though, they are going one direction. And so they're all going the same direction. They might veer off a little bit. They will take advantage of little prey insects as they fly, and they'll snag a piece of food every now and again. But they're mostly just moving in one direction. We also see differences in the heights they fly, depending on whether you're looking at a feeding or a migratory swarm. Feeding swarms are pretty low to the ground. Typically, they're only about 1 to 10 feet off the ground, and typically kind of about chest height on an average adult. So they're flying like right where we can see them really easily. Migratory swarms, though, they can be low to the ground, like the one in the video from TikTok. That was pretty low to the ground, but they also fly really, really, really high. Most of these migratory swarms are happening way up where like hawks are migrating, so they're very high up off the ground. I think we don't see anywhere near the number of migratory swarms that are out there because they're so high up that people just cannot see them. I mean, dragonflies are big as insects go, but when you have an animal that's this big and it's flying 300, 600, 800 feet up, you can't see that animal anymore. So even if you have millions of them in this big river of dragonflies, which they do, we just don't see them because they're so high up. And in fact, people that do hawk watches in the fall tend to see the most of these dragonfly swarms anywhere off the coast. The coastal ones tend to stay a lot lower to the ground, but anywhere else, they're going to be flying really pretty high.
Hold on, let me get you a microphone.
You mentioned the coast a couple of times. Do dragonflies actually breed in salt water, or is it just fresh water?
They do not breed in salt water. They can, but they don't. There's a lot of reasons why entomologists think that insects aren't in the ocean. Largely, I think the favorite idea is that there are too many crustaceans in the ocean and that dragonflies and other aquatic insects just can't actually get in there and outcompete them. But yeah, they do not breed in the ocean, but they will fly over the ocean. Okay, so disturbances often precede swarms. And so these can be any kind of disturbance. I mean, big disturbances, little disturbances. Weather plays a really big role. If you have a really big storm or a hurricane coming in, you will see a huge upswing in the number of swarms that happen. And also right after a big storm passes, you'll also see that. If you have a really, really high wind day, it's kicking up all those little insects that are normally kind of like hunkered down on plants. You know, they get blown around and they kind of end up flying around in a way they might not otherwise, and the dragonflies will come and pick them off. If you have forest fires or wildfires, that will burn the habitat where these dragonflies or these little prey insects are hanging out, and then the dragonflies will come and eat the little prey insects. If you have a drought, you have the habitat of these dragonflies dry up. They have to go somewhere else. People mowing their backyards. Lots and lots and lots of people tell me about swarms that happen after they mow because, again, they're kind of kicking up all those little insects that were in their lawn, and then all these dragonflies will come in and pick them off. So you have lots of these disturbances happening before swarms. Feeding swarms are reported way more often than migratory swarms. And again, I think that's because people just can't see most of the migratory swarms. They're too high up for us to see. But people do see these feeding swarms a lot. And I've got a map here in just a little bit. I'll show where those are happening. Most of these swarms are happening at dusk. I don't know whether that's because more little insects are flying around at dusk. I think that's probably what's happened, that, mosquitoes come out at dusk. They're crepuscular animals. And so all these dragonflies are feeding at the same time that those mosquitoes are out. And there's other insects that do that. But I also think that people tend to see them a little bit more at that time of day, too. Swarms are most often reported in late summer. So right now we're like right at the very tail end of the dragonfly swarming season. Still possible to see one, but less likely than a little bit earlier. So like August, September, really kind of the prime time for this. And then swarms can be any size. You can have one individual that's kind of doing this swarming behavior. Like I can recognize one individual doing this behavior. But swarms are typically, most people report about 100 individuals, but they can be millions. And one scientific paper reported an estimate of something like 1 billion dragonflies in a swarm. So they can be huge. And the migratory swarms do tend to be a little bit bigger than the feeding swarms, but it varies a lot depending on the individual swarm. Swarms can be made up of males and females. This is actually kind of really interesting because dragonflies don't tend to interact with each other all that much. Female dragonflies are harassed badly by males at bodies of water. In fact, there's species in Europe that play dead when they're getting harassed so much by the males that they're done. They just stop flying and fall to the ground and pretend they're dead until the male goes away, and then they fly off. And so most of the time, the females are kind of away from the water. They don't want to hang out with the males. They only come to the water to actually mate and lay their eggs. So when you have these big swarms and you have males and females flying together, it's really pretty exciting because they aren't typically interacting all that much, and really only when that female wants to mate. And then swarms can be made up of several species. This is also really exciting. You'll see multiple species at a pond, but they're not really interacting with each other much. So them all flying together in these big groups is really pretty interesting. You just don't see that all that often. So you might have, 5 or 6 or 8 species in a swarm, which is really, really pretty cool. Okay, let me show you where swarms occur. So this is a map of the feeding swarms. This is only about 5 years worth of data here. If I put all the data on, you can't actually see anything except this giant red mass here. But as you can see, you have more of these feeding swarms in the eastern part of the country than the west. This is probably simply just because there is a lot less water in the west. There's not as much habitat for dragonflies. There aren't quite as many of them in that area as there are in the western or the eastern part of the country where we've got a lot more water. But you can also see that, it's kind of following some population centers as well. So places that have a lot of people tend to have a lot of swarms reported. And then this is the map of the migratory swarms. Far, far, far fewer of them. People just don't see them as often. But you can see here that, they're following coastlines. They are following major rivers. And so you can see up here, like this is, I believe, the Illinois or Ohio River, I don't remember. There's a river that goes through here. And then you have the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers here. They're kind of following these major rivers. They're also following coasts in a really big way. There's also migratory dragonflies on the west coast. We have a different species in the west than we have here in the east, but they're following the coastline as well. So you see these following these coastlines really heavily. It's pretty obvious that they're following major landmarks, the way that birds and some other things would as well. And then we also see that an equal number of swarms are reported in urban and rural areas. I think they're probably happening more often in rural areas, but there are fewer people to report them. And so you end up getting this kind of half and half kind of thing where you have lots and lots and lots of these swarms reported in urban areas because there are lots of people there to see them, but there's probably quite a few more of them out in the rural areas. But it's kind of interesting that people are seeing these in urban areas. There was actually a really big swarm in New York a few years ago, and people were freaking out about it. People always freak out about these things. Lots and lots of dragonflies show up, and they're like, "Oh my God, what's happening?" But they're just eating insects. So I try to quell everyone's fears. And they're not doing anything to you. They're just there to eat all those little bugs you don't want around. So just let them do their thing. But those were flying down Fifth Avenue, and people were seeing them from their apartment buildings and right in urban Manhattan. Okay, so swarms happen worldwide in wetter regions and mid-latitudes. So anywhere that it's warm enough to have dragonflies, you are likely to see these swarms. I have found reports from 63 countries so far, so this is happening all over the world. Most of mine come from the U.S. just because my website is based in the U.S. I'm based in the U.S. My website's in English, so people have to speak English to be able to make a report in the first place. But 63 countries is pretty exciting. These are happening everywhere, and I have reports from every continent except Antarctica. Dragonflies fly over Antarctica, I'm sure, but they're not landing in Antarctica. It's never warm enough for them there. Best conditions for these swarms, lots and lots of prey insects. So if there's lots of little animals for them to eat, they're going to be there. Late July through September is kind of the peak season for these. They typically fly at dusk. They fly most often, even the feeding swarms happen more often along the migratory routes than anywhere else. And they are most likely to happen after a disturbance or right before a big storm. Storms push a lot of things in front of them, so you get some big surges right before storms, but everything else tends to happen after a disturbance. Okay, so why should we care about this? Dragonflies like to eat. They eat a lot of little prey insects, and they eat a lot of things that we don't want around. They eat mosquitoes and black flies and no-see-ums and all kinds of other things that bite people, that make us miserable, that transmit diseases to us. So we should really love to have dragonflies around. And in fact, one of the things that people report in that last question about share anything you want is that they'll go out and stand in the middle of these swarms, and there are mosquitoes all over their area. But if they go stand in the middle of the swarm, there are no mosquitoes in there because the dragonflies are eating them so efficiently that they are basically disappearing entirely within that swarm. Dragonflies have something like a 95 to 97% prey capture success rate. It's the highest of any animal documented so far. So they're very, very, very efficient at eating. I think swarms help limit prey populations. You see these big surges in these little prey insects, and then you have all these dragonflies that fly in. So I think that what's happening here is they are kind of controlling the prey populations. They're helping bring nature back into balance. So when something happens and it kind of knocks things out of place, the dragonflies kind of take care of the excess. You'll especially see this after hurricanes. You have all this standing water everywhere, and a ton of mosquitoes come out after hurricanes. And then dragonflies will move in very large numbers and pick off all those little mosquitoes that are starting to grow. And then dragonflies eat so many insects that cause human misery. We should all want dragonflies around us all the time because they do help eat mosquitoes and other things that transmit diseases to us and make us really itchy. Okay, few interesting participant demographics before we switch over to the other project. Female participants outnumber males in this project 3-to-1, which I think is phenomenal. Women don't have this reputation for being big lovers of insects, so it makes me really happy that there are more women than men participating in this project with me. People are really great at describing the behavior. They can tell me a really clear story about what they saw these animals doing. But they're really terrible at identifying the species, which is not surprising, and estimating both swarm size and the size of the dragonflies. I can't tell you how many people have told me that they saw a dragonfly that was a foot across. That does not exist on our planet. The biggest dragonfly on the planet is only about this big, so they're not that big. So people are terrible at estimating sizes, and it's hard because they're far away. You're seeing them from a distance. It's hard to estimate the size. So I kind of have to throw out that data, but I can use the descriptions of the behavior in a really big way. So I have a few more questions that I'm really trying to answer with this project. It's still going. I am really curious if all species swarm. It's looking like probably all species are capable of doing this. Not all of them have been reported doing it yet, but I'm really interested to keep this project going really long term because I want to answer some of these bigger questions. I'm really curious about if there are places where these are more likely to swarm than others. Some people in the reports that they make talk about how they've had dragonflies coming to their yard year after year after year, and they expect them at a certain time every year. And so clearly something is good about that particular spot versus some other spots. I'm really interested if this behavior is more likely in certain species than others. And I'm really, really curious about how these swarms actually form. How do they know that they should start forming this big group of dragonflies, particularly for the feeding swarms? I have two ideas about what might be happening. I think they can recognize that kind of behavior that they do, that flight pattern that they do. So if a dragonfly is flying over and it sees another dragonfly below it that's doing that kind of either figure 8 or rectangular flight, that maybe they can recognize that, oh, hey, that dragonfly found food, I'm going to go check it out, and they'll fly down and go to take advantage of the prey. Or they're all just finding it individually. So every individual dragonfly could potentially see that glut of prey insects and go to check it out on its own and form a swarm that way. So I have a few ideas about how to actually test this. I haven't had a chance to do it yet, but I'm really excited about kind of figuring out how that swarm actually develops in the first place. Okay, if you happen to see a swarm, you can report it at thedragonflywoman.com. There's a little pull down for the Dragonfly Swarm Project. If you see one, I would love to have your story added to the group of stories that we have. I think I got out to about 13,000 observations this year, which is enough to actually start to understand some things about this behavior, but we can always use more. Because there's always some weird thing that pops up. Someone sees something really weird, and it adds a new question to the batch. Okay, now we're going to switch over to another project for the last little bit of this. So Dragonfly Detectives was a completely different kind of project. So this one started off as an educational project that we did in collaboration with the state parks here in North Carolina. And they wanted to have a citizen science project where kids could go to the state parks multiple times and be doing some work together. And so we developed this project called Dragonfly Detectives. And let me tell you a little bit about what happened, because I really loved what came out of this one. So my favorite question of all time, and I don't know why, but I really love how dragonflies respond to changes in weather. They do some really weird things. They have this behavior called pond abandonment, where when a storm comes in, they actually completely leave bodies of water. We don't know where they go or why they leave. They are reported over and over and over in the scientific literature. You'll read statements about, my methods. I went out on these days during this time period from this part of the day to this part of the day, except on days where it was rainy, cloudy, cold, whatever. There's always caveats. They throw out data in a lot of these studies when the weather's not perfect. So clearly something's happening with this weather interaction with these insects. And so I just love this topic. This is what I worked on as an undergrad for my senior thesis. This is what I wanted to do in grad school. It was not going to work in Arizona when I went to grad school because weather there is not predictable in any way. And so I switched to something else. But this has always been my pet project, and I was really excited to have kids do it with me. So I really wanted to think about what we could do with this question if we had help answering it, and then particularly what would happen if we had kids help with this. So I'm going to talk about two different things with this project because we had two different sets of questions. But let me tell you how it worked. So dragonfly detectives. We had questions that we wanted to answer, and so we asked all the kids the same question. So all the kids that participated, we had about 450 of them all together over 5 years, answer the question, how do changes in the weather impact flight activity on the common whitetail? And this is the common whitetail here. You can see this dragonfly. It's super common in our state, as the name suggests. It's found pretty much everywhere, mountains to the sea. It is pretty much one of the first dragonflies that comes out at the beginning of the dragonfly flight season, and it's one of the last ones to leave. So we knew we could see it in lots of different parts of the state. So that's why we chose that one. But I also wanted to learn whether kids could collect useful citizen science data. If you've ever done anything with citizen science data, you almost always have to prove that the people that collected the data collected it accurately, because there is a lot of skepticism related to citizen scientists' collected data. And so we wanted to know whether kids in particular could collect data that was actually useful, because if we're skeptical of adults, people are really skeptical of kids. And I believe that they could do it, and I really wanted to show that that was possible. So we recruited and trained leaders at multiple sites throughout the state. We had 25 sites altogether over the 5 years. So many of them were state parks, but we also had arboreta and botanical gardens, and I think the zoo had one year. We had a couple of schools. So there were multiple different sites across the state. They would all come to Raleigh. I would train them how to identify the dragonflies that we needed, teach them all the protocols, give them all the equipment that they needed to do this project, and then they would go back to their site and lead it on their own. And the way it works is this was for grades 4 through 8, so the kids were anywhere from about 10 to 13 or so. And they met at whatever outdoor facility they were at for 2 hours once a week for 6 weeks. Technically, on the first day, the people would go to whatever site they came from, so their school or their after-school program or whatever place they were located. And then the kids would learn in that first week the dragonflies that they needed to identify. We were mostly looking at the common whitetails, but we had a couple of other projects we were having them do as well. So they were identifying 5 species, 2 species. And then we walked them through all the protocols and all the equipment that they needed to do the project. In weeks 2 through 5, they were going to the site where their host was located. We provided transportation funding so that we could get them to those sites. That ended up being an absolute nightmare. Providing transportation to school kids sounds like a really easy thing to do. You're like, here, pay for the bus. And it was impossible to get them to these sites. In Goldsboro, we had kids that were going to Cliffs of the Neuse. The only company we could find that could transport them, because the school buses couldn't do it, was a limousine company. And so the kids rode from their school to Cliffs of the Neuse in a limousine, which they thought was the best thing ever. Yeah, getting them to these parks was really hard. But once they were there, we had them collecting data periodically throughout this kind of 2-hour period. And then in between that, we had a lot of different fun activities for them where they were, getting in the water and looking for dragonfly nymphs and damselfly nymphs. They were learning about dragonfly migrations. They were doing mercury capture studies. So we gave them all nets that they got to keep at the end of the program. They collected dragonflies. We would draw something on their wings and let them go as a demonstration of how hard it is to actually track migrating dragonflies. Once you mark a dragonfly, it leaves and you never see it again. And so it's really, really hard. You can't just do what you do with monarchs where you put a sticker on their wing and let them go and expect to see them again. So we had them doing all these different fun activities, and then they were collecting data usually 6 times during a 2-hour period for 3 minutes at a time. And then on the last week, they would make a scientific poster based on all their results. Now, I know the kids hated the data collection because I'll tell you how we did our accuracy and precision data collection here in a moment. But I could hear the kids complaining about how much they hated the data collection. They complained about it nonstop every single time. But once they got to the part where they made their poster, they loved that part. Everyone was really skeptical that the kids were going to want to do this poster because it was very school-like. But that was the time where they realized that they'd actually learned something, and they were really into it. Some places were having a hard time dragging their kids away from their posters, which I thought was the best thing ever. And so they created a poster at the end. And then they had the option of presenting at BugFest here at the museum. So we had a little poster session where they had their posters up. And, you know, we have 20,000 plus people that come to BugFest. So these are kids that are as young as 10 years old standing in front of, you know, 30,000 or 20 to 30,000 people talking about dragonflies. They were always terrified at first, but then once they kind of warmed up, they got really into it. Once they realized they knew more about dragonflies than anyone else here, they would get really, really into it and like trap people for 20 minutes at a time at their poster. It was super fun. Collecting weather data. We would divide each group up into 3 kids. So we would have these groups of 3. One group of 3 would collect the weather data. And so you can see them here collecting the data. We use this Kestrel weather device here. It's just a little handheld weather device. And that measured the temperature, the wind speed, the wind direction, the barometric pressure, and the humidity. Then we had a light meter that measured light intensity. And then they just reported whether it was raining or not. Everyone can figure out whether it's raining or not without a special device. So we had one group of kids that during a 3-minute time period were measuring all these different things. They would write it down in their little workbook. And then everyone else in the group would be in these groups of 3 lined up at the body of water that they were at. And they were counting dragonflies. So each group of 3 would discuss amongst themselves what their imaginary line that they were going to use. And every time a common whitetail crossed that line, they would count it. And so we had them in groups of 3 for a particular reason I'll share here in a moment. But we had them counting dragonflies while the other group was measuring the weather data. And then they would combine those 2 sets of data together. They would have all the counts and then all the weather parameters. And so they would be able to start making connections. At least by the second week that they were out in the field, they were starting to see some connections between the weather conditions and how many flights they were seeing. And then here's their posters. They would, draw lots of dragonflies on them. They were making everything really colorful. They were sharing all their graphs, and it was super fun. Having them here at BugFest was just the best thing. So, like I said, we also were measuring how effective these kids were at the actual data collection. And so we kind of built into the protocols how we were collecting the data, built in these measurements for precision and accuracy. So for precision, we were looking at pre and post ID quizzes. So we had them on the first day identify the dragonflies. We gave them a little lesson in it, and then they practiced identifying them. And then they took a quiz to see how many they could identify correctly. And then we did it again at the end of the program. And then we also had them compare their count with their group of 3 to their 2 peers that were in their group of 3. So the goal, because kids really like to one-up each other when they're counting things, was to get them closest to your peers as possible. So we really celebrated when a group, like everyone got the same count. We got really excited about that. Rather than focusing on counting the most, it was counting the best. And so we really tried to instill that in the kids, and it worked pretty well. And then we also, for accuracy, we had video recording at multiple sites where we set up cameras in front of the kids so that we could see what the kids were seeing. I could hear them on the videos discussing what their line was, so I knew what the line was. And then I would count how many dragonflies I saw across the line, and we would compare it to the kids' count. And so the group of 3, we would average their numbers unless one was like way off, and we would throw that one out. But we would compare their counts to my count to see how accurate they were. And here's what we learned. So we had 2 data sets, the scientific data that the kids were collecting with the weather and the counts, and then we had the precision and accuracy data. So let's talk about the scientific data. So the kids predicted that there were certain conditions that they would have the most dragonfly flights with. And that was temperature, the humidity, the light intensity, and wind speed. And here's what's actually important. So light intensity was a really big one. This is what I found when I was an undergrad doing work on weather and damselflies, was the light intensity was absolutely the most important, and that was true here as well. So light intensity, for the most part, goes up. Or as the light intensity goes up, the number of dragonfly flights also goes up. And so you have this positive correlation between the 2. With humidity, it's the opposite. They don't like humid conditions. I don't like humid conditions, so I don't blame them. But the number of flights tends to go down with an increase in humidity. So they prefer drier conditions over wet. I think this probably has something to do with their ability to thermoregulate their bodies. It's harder to cool off if you're really in a really humid condition, and it's just a little bit harder for them to function. But that's just a hypothesis. And temperature, as the temperature goes up, the number of flights tends to go up. But there's a caveat here. Here in North Carolina during the summer, we never get so hot that we reach the thermal limits of the dragonflies. Like, we never got to a point where they were starting to stop flying and seek shade because it just never got hot enough to do that. And we also didn't get cold enough that they completely stopped flying. There were definitely no flights down kind of below 74 degrees, but they can fly in lower temperatures than that. And we never got low enough that they can't fly at all. So the things that were not important were these. So the barometric pressure, the whether it was raining or not, the wind direction and the wind speed did not matter at all. And I've always thought this is really interesting. Like, barometric pressure would be a really easy thing for a dragonfly to sense, to know that there's a storm coming and that they might need to adjust their behavior or leave the pond entirely like they do before storms. But it doesn't seem to matter at all, which is really interesting. Okay, so the kids found that there were 3 weather parameters that mattered the most, and they all, made predictions on the first day and then assessed whether they were right or not as part of their poster. But we were also, looking at this precision and accuracy data. This is the identification. So the first day, it's like 65% or so of them got all the identifications correct. But by the last day, it was about 90%. And so the accuracy of their identifications was going up. And when you were talking to these kids in the field, like, they knew which species was which, like, really well. There were a few kids that maybe weren't as into it, and they were a little bit less accurate. But most of the kids could identify all 5 species really accurately. And then when we looked at their percent agreement with their peers, that also went up. So on the first day, they were pretty terrible. It was like 32, 33% accuracy with their peers. And so when we were comparing those 3 counts, they were not doing so well. But by the 3rd day that they were in the field, they were getting really pretty high. And so that gap between those counts was getting a lot smaller. And so they were getting more precise. And then when we were looking at the accuracy, when we were comparing their counts to mine, the first day they did a terrible job. So we threw out all the data from the first day because we know it wasn't usable. But by the 3rd day, their counts were statistically indistinguishable from mine. And so by the 3rd day, when they'd had experience making these counts, it's usually like 10 or 12 times at that point, they were able to do this really pretty accurately. And I was really excited about this because this right here tells you that kids can actually do this work. And kids that are as young as 10 were doing this work. They were identifying things down to species. They were accurately counting. And so they were creating really great data sets. Okay, so the takeaways from this project. Common whitetails are most active in dry, warm, bright conditions. So basically, they like the same perfect sunny day that I like. They don't want it to be too hot. They don't want it to be too humid. They really just like a nice summer day. And children can be effective as data collectors for citizen science projects. You just need to make sure they have some repeat exposure and that you're explaining what you need them to do really clearly. And then they are fully capable of taking part in this type of science and creating really great data sets along with everyone else. All right, couple parting thoughts, and then I'd be happy to take any questions. So why study dragonflies with citizen science? The first is these are really charismatic insects. Like, this is one of the insect groups that people actually like. Not everyone likes them, but a lot of people do. So these are up there with butterflies as far as like most popular insects. It's like butterflies way at the top, dragonflies a little bit below them. But they're amazing. They're beautiful. People see them, they notice them, they love them. People get tattoos of them. That's always a good sign that an insect is really popular when lots of people get tattoos. The data accuracy for these types of projects is really high. People can collect this information really, really accurately, and it really adds a lot of information to what we as scientists can collect on our own. Like, I'm really one of the only people in the world that studies dragonfly swarms. I cannot be in enough places at enough time to actually study this behavior on my own. I have to have other people help me, and this is a really good approach. And having all these people, these 13,000 observations means that I can study this in a much more detailed, much more efficient way than I would ever be able to in my entire life on my own. So it's just a really, really great way to do this sort of work. All right, I'm going to leave you with one of my dragonfly detectives here. This girl was so scared she was going to hurt the dragonflies the first day that she like burst into tears, and her mom emailed me to say she thought her daughter needed to come out of the program because she was so upset that we were catching these dragonflies and we were hurting them. And this was her on the last day. She ended up creating a dragonfly club in her neighborhood and invited all her neighbor friends to come and like learn about dragonflies with her, and they were going out and collecting data at their ponds, and it was the cutest thing. So here you go. And I'd be happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Let's give Chris a round of applause first. Excellent job. Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing. If you've got questions and you're here with me on the first floor, just wave at me. I'll bring you a microphone. If you're on the balconies, wave down at us so we notice, and then you can yell at us with your questions. And if you're watching on YouTube, I've got the chat pulled up. You can post your questions there, and we'll share them into the program.
So information on large accumulations of marine species, like the deep scattering layer or krill swarms, were originally found by naval sonar. Even if we can't see 1 million dragonflies 500 feet up, do NOAA or even, I don't know, the FAA have any scan data, radar that could potentially get at some of that?
Yeah, they do actually show up on Doppler scans. But the trick is that they're migrating at the same time birds are migrating, and so it's a little bit tricky to distinguish what's specifically dragonflies versus what's the big groups of birds. But there have been documented instances where they know it was dragonflies in like huge areas of these migratory swarms. And so yes, they can show up, but it's a little bit tricky to distinguish the dragonflies from other larger things that are also flying at the same time.
I thought I saw more. There.
Hey, excellent talk. So I know you said that swarms can come in all different amounts. So you can have like a single individual to like millions or billions of dragonflies. But what's the benefit of traveling in such a big swarm? Because I feel like if I was the first dragonfly to get to a new place and maybe not have so many of my friends, I could eat more of the food that was there.
Yeah, so they are taking advantage of the huge increase in the number of available prey insects. So there's a huge number of these insects out that they can eat. So these big swarms are supported by the prey insect population. But I think when they are flying en masse, particularly in those big migratory swarms, the likelihood of your getting eaten if you're with 1 million other dragonflies is really, really small. And so it is beneficial to you to be moving with a lot of other individuals because you're going to gain some protection from that. They're also all kind of going together, and you can follow your peers in front of you. But I think there's so much food available at the time of year that they're moving around, and so many little prey insects that it can support those numbers. They also can eat as they fly, so if they're up high enough, they're up where all the aerial plankton is, so they can just eat as they go. And they just scoop insects up with their legs and shove it into their mouths and eat while they're flying. And so they can eat along the way, then they'll stop, and they'll usually spend 2 or 3 days on the ground kind of feeding as much as they can, and then they'll get up and fly again. But yeah. I think protection is probably the biggest reason.
Great questions. Here's one from the chat on YouTube for you. Are dragonfly numbers tracking with the unfortunate insect population decline or at a noticeably faster or slower rate?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Unfortunately, there is enough people in the world studying dragonflies to have a really good, clear idea of that. I have not personally noticed a very big change in the numbers, but it's hard. Like, you have to watch over many years to be able to start to see those differences. And I've been here 13 years, so I feel like most of the common species are definitely still around. But we have some kind of weird conditions in this area where we get some things that are a little bit less common to begin with. So it's a little bit hard to track. I'm hoping I can do that a little bit more with more years watching dragonflies.
Not a question, just thought I'd tell you my daughter's 17 and she still has her butterfly net from the Prairie Ridge and still chases butterflies.
That makes me so happy. That's why we wanted to give them equipment. Dragonfly detectives, we gave them a dragonfly field guide and a net and a few other things to take with them when they were done. So we were hoping that they would continue to use them. So thank you for telling me that. That makes me so happy.
Chris, thanks for a great talk. Hey, I want to know what's the typical span
All right, it's a typical lifespan, right? Yeah, so in our area, most of them are about a year. And so they spend most of their lives as immatures in the water. So they'll lay eggs sometime in the summer. Those eggs will develop over close to a year underwater, and then they will emerge as adults. The adults are typically on land somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks. So over an entire year lifespan, the adult stage is really short. But yeah, that's typically what they do. It depends where you are, though. Like here, we have warm water, and so the speed at which they can develop is a lot higher than the same species further north. So things that are, if we have the same species as Maine, for example, or Alaska, and some of our species are that widespread, it takes them like 2 or 3 or 4 years to develop. In colder water, when here, they develop really quickly in a year.
I think you kind of hinted at it there. What distances do these migratory swarms cross? Are they crossing oceans? Are they crossing continents?
So it's a little bit tricky to actually measure that because you have to put trackers on them. So far, the batteries have not been so amazing that they can actually track them the full distance that they go. So we don't know exactly where they go. We do know that they tend to fly a few hundred miles and then they'll stop. And they'll kind of hang out near the ground, eat a lot, and then they'll get up and fly again. So they're typically on like a 3-day cycle. You know, they'll fly one day, they'll land for 2 days, eat, and then they'll fly again. So they're traveling like 200 to 500 miles at a time. But so far in the U.S., we haven't gotten batteries that are small enough that we can actually track them all the way out of the country. So the best studies so far, they started in Cape May, and I think they got to Georgia before the batteries died. And so they couldn't figure out where they go. We think they go somewhere to Central or South America. We don't know exactly where yet. And they are almost surely flying, at least some of them, flying across the Gulf of Mexico to get there. But there are species, the insect that has the longest migration in the world is actually a dragonfly. It is the wandering glider. It can fly across oceans, entire oceans, like the Atlantic Ocean. It can fly from here to Europe on its own power. They will land on shipping containers, like out in the middle of the ocean every now and again in very large numbers. And it's found on every continent on the planet except for Antarctica because it's flown there on its own. So some species can fly across oceans in a really pretty big way. Their migration between India and Africa is considered the longest insect migration because they're flying about 10,000 miles. It's multiple generations, so it's not exactly like the monarchs where they're flying all the way to Mexico and then most of the way back. But that's the longest insect migration known. And yes, they are flying across oceans in that case. But not all of them can do that.
Fascinating stuff. So another one online. How many swarms have you been able to see in person?
Oh, I haven't actually counted mine, but I think it's in the realm of 60.
Wow. 60 swarms.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you have a sense for it?
I think I do at Prairie Ridge in particular because I have like certain conditions that I can kind of know, like if it's a warm day, it's kind of late August, early September. If we've seen a lot of little gnats out that day, like I expect them to start to show up right around golden hour. So when the light starts going down a little bit, like I expect to see them, and I frequently do, but I don't always. So it's a little hit or miss. But yeah, I think I've seen about 60.
That's really cool. I've seen none, so I need to come spend more time out at Prairie Ridge. Chris, can you tell me a little bit about the planning that goes into putting a citizen science project together, especially for kids? Like, just doing any scientific project, there's a lot of planning that goes into how you get the data and make sure that it's verifiable and reproducible, things like that. And you've definitely showed that kids are capable of doing that, but they certainly need different guidelines, different sets of rules, and ways of participating that allow them to be successful in that way. So how do you plan for that at the start of a project that you want kids to participate in? For others that may be saying, yeah, I want to do projects with kids and collect good scientific data, where do they start?
Yeah, so I thought first about the things that I wanted to get out of it. So I needed them to accurately measure the weather conditions, and they needed to accurately count. And so that's all I needed. So my expectations of what I needed were pretty low to begin with. Like everyone can count if they're 10 years old. They should be able to count pretty well. The equipment, we just needed to show them how to use it. One of the things with Dragonfly detectives is we did have people that were trained at every site, so they weren't just reading it online, they were actually doing it. So that first day they were practicing using all the equipment, they were practicing identifying things. Once they got out the first day, they were practicing doing the counts. That's why the data on the first day was pretty terrible. You know, they hadn't actually had that exposure yet, and so once they had practiced a little bit more, they were a lot more effective at it. But just trying to outsmart the kids was what I guess I was thinking of the whole time. I was like, I know that they like to one-up each other when they count, because I've spent enough time with kids to know that they like to do that. So I wanted to try to counteract that tendency as much as possible. So we did shift it into getting the most accurate count possible, so we could try to prevent that one-upmanship that they like to do. We really tried to emphasize the fact that they were helping scientists as much as possible, because that makes them want to do it more accurately in a lot of cases. So really emphasizing the fact that they were creating the data that was being used in this project. Like their data mattered, that what they were doing was contributing. All of our data came from these kids. And so if they were doing it badly, it impacted kind of the overall results. And so we really tried to focus on that as much as possible. But then it just gave them more experience, like had them do it over and over and over and over again. The more you practice with something, the better you get. And so we really wanted to emphasize that.
Excellent stuff. A few comments that came in for you, just because I think you'll love this. One of our viewers said that they had kids come out and do a stream cleanup or an area cleanup, and they thought they had already cleaned everything up, and then the kids found a ton more litter and debris, because kids are great at this stuff.
Yep, they're very good at that.
And Christina learned that aerial plankton exists. So I think you did double duty in the presentation today with dragonfly knowledge and citizen science knowledge and collaborative science info.
I love the idea of aerial plankton. There's a really great video that NPR put out a few years ago about this ladybug like flying up and then getting caught up in the winds and like getting up into the area of the atmosphere that has the aerial plankton. It's like all these little insects get swept up by the winds and get kind of trapped. But then it's available as food for all these other animals that are flying up there.
That's amazing. Nature is wild, y'all. Let's give Chris Goforth one more round of applause to say thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Excellent stuff. And, of course, we'll be back here next Wednesday with another edition of the Lunchtime Discovery Series. We've got Dr. Luke Etchison, who's with DEQ who's with Wildlife Resources. Thank you very much, Marty. Who's with Wildlife Resources. We're going to be talking about more impacts and aftermath of Hurricane Helene on aquatic ecosystems. That's next Wednesday at noon. So check out eenorthcarolina.org. There you can get information on that program. You can also sign up for the Lunchtime Discovery Series email newsletter. That way every week you get the email in your inbox with the link to join and the information of whether you can come and join us here inside the globe for the program or if you need to tune in online only. Thanks so much for being here, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Great questions. We'll see you next time. Bye, folks.